Welcome to this evening. Another interesting session, another interesting talk from CIC. This is on a subject that is uppermost in the minds of most people here, at least in the city of Chennai, in terms of urban services, urban development, infrastructure, etc. And we have two great people to discuss this topic today. Let me welcome Dr. Ramesh Subramaniam and Mr. Krishnan, IAS. So on behalf of CIC, it gives me great pleasure to invite the two of you for this talk this evening. Let me give a little bit of an introduction about the speaker, Dr. Ramesh Subramaniam. I think the invitation said Ramesh Subramanian. There is a big difference between the N and an M. It's actually a statewide difference. So it's Mr. Ramesh Subramaniam. He's been with ADB since Asian Development Bank since 1997. He's the Director General of Southeast Asia Development, covering all the ASEAN countries, responsible for all country relationship and sovereign project operations in the ASEAN region. This department covers several countries, including Philippines, where ADB is headquartered, Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on. The operations bit that he is the Director General of, that portfolio includes urban development and water, energy, environment, transport and communication, public management, social development, etc. As you can see, it pretty much covers everything about a urban city. It will be interesting for those of you who are interested to go and see the organization chart that is in the ADB site. It lists out all the activities. Some of them are a mouthful, but that encompasses everything around urban development. He is also overseeing the creation of green cities and smart cities. And just to see what type of work goes on there, I want to quote from one of the articles or one of the op-eds that Mr. Subramaniam has written, which is available in the ADB website, about Melaka city in Philippines. I think it's pronounced right. Melaka is the name of the city. In the last 5 years, Melaka has made great strides towards building a sustainable green city in 5 years. By 2020, the government run about 7,300 hectares of Melaka World Solar Valley aims to power most of the daily activities of manufacturers, housing developers, farmers, and other stakeholders, entirely solar powered. Recently, a public-private partnership installed 100,000 LED street lamps along the major highway, which will improve road safety and reduce carbon dioxide emissions. The urban landscape has also changed. Walkable neighborhoods with mixed-use development have increased foot traffic and reduced car use, which is something that the city of Chennai is attempting to do now. The Melaka River, along a polluted backyard drainage canal, is now a popular gathering place and tourist attraction. Okay. We can visualize such a thing in our city also. Melaka's transformation is the result of meticulous planning, a comprehensive approach supported by government policies and projects, private sector engagement, and citizen initiatives. The Asian Development Bank is proud to have worked with Melaka to develop its roadmap and the Green City Action Plan. In addition to technical assistance and grant to underwrite the plan, which was completed in 2014, ADB also helped Melaka implement it, including by structuring bankable projects for solar energy and street lighting, setting up a database to track indicators in environment and economic growth, and conducting training in urban development, environment planning, and knowledge sharing. The Melaka projects are the first to be implemented under the Green Cities Initiative of the Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand Golden Triangle. It's acronymed IMTGT, an ADB-supported sub-regional cooperation program focused on the development of 32 provinces in these three countries. It aims to help states and provinces discover and use their relative comparative advantages to work together in the sub-region. So far, 4 other cities in Thailand, Medan, some of these are unpronounceable names for me, in Indonesia have developed similar plans. And the definition of a green city, this is very interesting, very a generous definition, very wide in its scope. A green city means an area that's resilient and inclusive, manages its natural resources well, promotes low carbon growth to remain competitive, and improves the livelihoods of all citizens. A very good statement that clearly defines what green city means. Ramesh Subramaniam's insight and learnings in these cities will greatly help us in Chennai in our search for water security, which is uppermost in the minds of most of us. Of course, we worry about it daily. Our concern is water security, and people like Krishnan worry about it 24/7. So I'm very glad that he is here to discuss the topic. To complete his resume of Dr. Subramaniam, he studied in Vivekananda College and Loyola College and earned his PhD in economics from McMaster University, Canada. He was later a finance and industry fellow at University of St. Andrews in UK and a Rockefeller fellow at Yale University. One of the advices that he has given, the leadership advice to the youth, very simple: be humble, be patient, be innovative, be courageous. Not just courageous, be morally courageous. Very few words, very powerful. It also gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Krishnan. All of you are familiar with Krishnan. He is not new to this forum, an active member of CIC. He is ready to participate in events. He provides guidance about the programs and invites great speakers. And he is also working hard, apart from water, working hard to establish a permanence for CIC, the Chennai International Center. Welcome to both of you. And with that introduction, let me request Ramesh Subramaniam to take the podium and make his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lakshminarayanan, for those very, very kind remarks, including the quotes that you found on what I had to say about youth. I'm very touched. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here, to be speaking to this audience. A few months ago, we had the great privilege and pleasure of having Mr. Viswanathan, of industrial economist at the ADB in Manila, where he had in fact spoken very nicely about the smart cities and urbanization related initiatives here in India as well as in the region to our urban group. A number of people had come, and in fact the talk that he gave has been referred to many times subsequently in the work that we are doing. So I'm very appreciative of the CIC for inviting me, as well as for Mr. Viswanathan to be suggesting that I do this talk here. Fantastic that we have Mr. Krishnan participating. We had a nice chat just before coming down here. Great to see some really old friends and contacts, including who used to be my guru, Mr. Swaminathan in ADB in 1997 to 99, 2000 or so, and Vaidhi Sastra, who used to be at the Asian Institute of Management in Manila. So with your permission, what I will do, I believe my presentation has been shared with you, and I think it will be shown on the screen. Storyline is pretty simple. As the topic says, multilateralism. What is the scope for multilateralism in this context of what may be seen as more nationalistic tendencies emerging in many countries? We see what is going on in the US, for example, in many countries, not just in the US, but many countries in Europe, Western Europe, to some extent in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and so on. So in that context, what role do multilateral development institutions have to play? Do you have a clicker that I can use? Thank you. What role do multilateral institutions have to play? So I'm going to share with you the overall storyline is pretty simple. Okay, if you can go to the storyline. Next one, if you can just keep, yeah, next one. Overall storyline is pretty simple. I'll first talk briefly about, as maybe that's my training as an economist, always talk a little bit about the macro situation in the region. And there is a lot of talk nowadays about the trade conflicts between the US and China. In the context of the topic today on multilateralism, what I want to leave you with is a thought that there is probably a misguided notion in many countries amongst policymakers that, oh, this is fantastic, two countries are fighting between them, this is a time to gain. Now that is a wrong notion to have. As I will show you a bit later in terms of what we see as the impact of trade tensions, in the short term, some countries will benefit, but in the medium term, everyone will be hurting. So there is clearly scope for multilateralism here. There may be a slew of things that are more regional, that are driven amongst a few countries will be emerging in the short term. That is okay. But I think in the medium term, certainly we do need to go back to the fundamental roots of multilateralism. Now, why so? I'll try to present a few arguments with you, and I'll be very happy to. Mr. Krishnan and I had a very good chat now. There are many dimensions of it. So that's number one. Number two, if you take a more medium-term perspective, I'll show you some data. I think to this audience, I should not be talking too much about India, but I will show you some data on India in terms of what are some of the key challenges, issues that we are facing. The interesting thing is that when it comes to medium-term challenges, urbanization that Mr. Lakshminarayanan talked about, you can take India's name out, you can plug Indonesia, you can plug Thailand, you can plug Philippines. All those challenges are true because all countries are certainly finding new solutions. They have significant deficits when it comes to infrastructure, so what can be done? Now there, what role multilateral institutions can play? And here I will bring in finally before I close the G20, the group of 20 countries recently set up a group called the Tharman Committee or the Eminent Persons Group headed by the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore or former Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam. That committee with a number of eminent people has come up with a few recommendations. So I'll just share that with you and then Mr. Krishnan will have insights to share. Now, there are lots of slides. I'll make sure it is not PowerPoint by death. And because the materials have already been shared with you, I'm just going to go through pretty quickly. Now, key messages, you'll see data here if you see a bit later. There is slowdown everywhere, but that is not to be something that is concerned about. That is because you've had, after the global financial crisis in 2008, there was recovery, numbers were going up. They've been going up for a while, but you do have softening that we see in the Western countries, and as a result, and particularly also because of what is happening in China, you will have growth slowing down for the next few years. But certainly, China I'll talk a little bit about, also including in the context of the trade tensions. Inflation picture is okay, but the primary risk still centers on the trade conflict. Now, here as you see, developing Asia's growth story is, it may look like if you particularly take, if you have the newly industrialized economies in, the numbers are lower because those economies have been growing slowly. That's just the nature of those economies. If you take them out, growth is slowing, the top bar on the left-hand side, top curve on the left-hand side, but 6.1 is actually still respectable, right? But the challenge that we see is that our countries, many of the developing countries in the region, ought to be growing probably at about 6.57%. Because only at that growth will incomes be doubling, and some of the medium-term challenges that I'm talking about, you will have resources, particularly including domestic resources. In this context, I do want to be very humble and unassuming. Institutions like ADB, World Bank, other multilateral institutions are important, but we are small. I think in the context of India, the share of official development assistance in total financing, I think is less than 0.5%. So what role can we play in using our capital more efficiently becomes important. So I won't go through in the interest of time. You have the major industrial economy slowing down. As a result, prospects in Asia Pacific are also will be kind of dimming. But still, as you saw, respectable growth across the region. Now, what is good news is that for this part of the world, South Asia is leading the pack amongst all the developing countries. South Asia's growth rate is among the highest, while it is slowing down, but it is certainly higher than the other sub-regions. Now, in this context, let me talk a little bit about the global trade tensions. These curves, you may not be, I think you will need to look at your device or a printed version. The trade activity has been basically slowing down. There was an upswing after the global financial crisis, which you do have in trade. You do have cyclical phenomenon happening always. You'll have ups and downs. So you saw upswing in activity, and then now you have the orange part. You have the partly driven, the trends that you see partly driven by the trade tensions between China and the US, which certainly is weighing down on exports and imports. Interesting thing is, imports have been, in fact, they are also slowing, but they picked up faster than exports because of the growth imperatives in the region. Good news is, maybe not so good news in some countries, but good news in terms of certainly if you look at it from a more even distribution of wealth point of view, a demand side is the savior. So demand side factors have been contributing quite strongly to growth in many countries, as you see, particularly in China and India, and also on the right hand side, if you see in some of the ASEAN, Southeast Asian economies. Now, here, as you will see, there is growth will be subduing, as I mentioned. But South Asia story is actually pretty good. I think for the next couple of years at least, you will have growth being stable and picking up probably by about 0.2, 0.3 percentage points. Now, what is happening in China? There may be interest in the audience in terms of, we all know China is a humongous player because of their size as well as strategic positioning that they have had. But China, I think, there are some countries that feel that if a big economy sneezes, then we catch a complete flu right away. We don't need to wait for any transmission mechanism. In that sense, what's happening in China clearly is a reflection of structural reforms and adjustments that are going there. On the right-hand side, you see some of the policy tightening that is taking place be in the banking sector. Just one example you see in the figure on the right-hand side is shadow banking. China's banking system is humongous, largely state-controlled. There has also been an emergence of what is known as shadow banking. There have been a lot of concerns that the growth has been outpacing what regulators can do, but China is taking steps in such behemoth system. They are clamping down on shadow banking. That's why the activity is going down. That's just to show what is happening. And there are government's priority, given the political system that they have to stave off any crisis, because financial risks would be quite unbearable. It will lead to a lot of problems. Second aspect that you see on the right hand side in blue, China has taken this very, very seriously. This is a country in the ADB context never used to borrow for what we call as policy reforms. India is another country. India has never borrowed for policy reforms at the national level, which is a good thing. State level, there are reforms that have been happening, which are supported through ADB and World Bank for policy reforms. China has never borrowed until recently, but now they have started engaging with us for combating environmental pollution, because some of the things that Mr. Lakshminarayanan mentioned, We have a lot of green city type of work going on in different parts of China, and they are engaging with us quite significantly. Third one, top priority. If you look at the western parts of China, eliminating poverty, given the huge inequality you have between different parts of the country, are very, very important. So, lessons to learn, certainly in a large economy, those factors have global impact, but also how they are having significant impact at the national level. So I'm going to shift some of these very quickly. Essentially, what is these charts show, or the phenomenon in terms of the demand story that I conveyed earlier, which are having a big impact on what we are seeing. Inflation, I had mentioned in the overview that price stability is not a concern for policymakers. Across the board, there are short-term blips, but what we see is that at least in the next 2 years, 3 years or so, the commodity price movements are likely to be favorable, that you won't have big spikes in inflation. That is, I think, sorry. Now, so but at the same time, while growth is kind of slowing down, South Asia is doing okay. But what are the downside risks? Here is where the China-US trade tensions come into play. Now, I really apologize. The screen is actually not too large, but I hope you can. Those of you who are interested, I'll send you the PowerPoint. I think Benita CIC would have sent it to you. The data are here interesting. Essentially, what in terms of colors, blue bar represents US and red represents China. You will see that interestingly in the short term, US is gaining from the China-US trade tensions. That is why probably the rhetoric on the US side is quite strong. The Chinese side is kind of backing off, but still, as it often happens in trade conflicts, no side should be seen as backing off. You do see a lot of posturing that are going on, but these are talking about different scenarios. The bottom line here is what you may not be able to see on the top left-hand part of the picture. The losses that we are estimating are huge, $1.3 trillion. $1.3 trillion so far because of the trade tensions that we are seeing between the two countries, which is actually quite worrisome, because this is the cobweb or the whatever this picture that you see on the left hand side. Global supply chains are very complex, and the three big blue bars are China, Germany, and the United States. And the green ones are the middle one, and the orange ones are in the third tier. India is in the middle green one. It could become a blue, but our own estimator said it will probably take at least about 15 to 20 years for it to become if you were to get into the top 5 countries in the global value chain or global supply chain. But clearly the dominance of China means that, and the US means that the trade tensions are something to reckon with. I'll skip this. Basically here, if you see the story, in the interest of time, I won't take you through all the slides. I want to go into the medium term, but I'll be happy to respond to any questions later. Is the point that I made earlier. Short term, fun. It's good. Some countries will benefit, and I'll show you particularly which countries will benefit. Here, I'm going to skip. Okay, sorry. This is the left-hand panel is the impact on China and the group of 3 countries, the large economies, and then on developing Asia, you don't see any upside swing. All of them are below the line. Now, if you add some trade redirection, many of you may know China is a huge producer and exporter of soybean. Other countries are positioning. Vietnam is one country that is positioning itself in soybean market. We did a study on are there adequate complementarities amongst groups of countries, say within the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or if you look at the South Asian context, although SAARC for political reasons has been somewhat weaker, we looked at groups of countries to see are there adequate complementarities amongst these countries to position themselves effectively. The answer is not really, because many of these countries in that value chain picture that I showed, they're all late entrants, and they're all relatively small players. I think in 10 years' time, they'll become big players, but right now, they don't have enough to gain out of the trade tensions that are taking place. So, what do we see? So, these are the whatever yellow bars that you see. Vietnam, the tallest bar is Vietnam, the yellow bar, and they will benefit from relatively low value adding products, which is textiles. So even in textiles, they are not able to gain in a big way, and the gains may not be sustained over the long term. I think the other blip that you see is interestingly Philippines. Many may not know, Philippines has been very quietly going into the electronics sector. And then they've done quite well, and they're gaining in the short term. Now, question that I have asked, many others have asked, why don't we see India in this picture? That is because India, despite its size, our domestic demand is so strong that we don't need to rely on external trade. But at the same time, are we producing enough that will give us advantage to gain from the US-China trade tensions? The answer is no. So, what is the story? I'm going to, again, in the interest of, by the way, these pictures are basically confidence indices. When private sector large private sector players, what do they feel about what the future holds? Essentially, it's one of concern that that there is not too much to gain from the trade tensions that are going on. So I'm just going to, basically, before I leave this and go into the next section, I would like to request, we can debate this, I'd like to request you to keep in mind that short-term gains will be there, but the tensions or trade tensions are not going to benefit anybody in the long term. We have in our ADB analysis, we call it the noodle bowl effect. Like in Chinese noodles, when you turn the noodles around, you're going to have concoction of various lots of small things, piecemeal type of efforts emerging. Bilateral trade agreements are good, but only in the short term. Even regional agreements are probably pragmatic when we are looking at the world trade order failing. WTO is kind of collapsing. There are some people think it's all but dead, but there are those of us who are optimistic it will be revived at some point. But clearly, the noodle bowl type of thing is not really sustainable. So no country should feel, of course, countries will be nationalistic. They need to gain in the short term from the trade tensions. But I think this big picture thinking of looking at issues nationally and regionally, but do act locally, because political economy concerns will always be there. How do you achieve that balance is going to be the key priority for policymakers in the coming months, not even years, coming months. So now with that, I'm going to take you through the medium-term challenges. And what do we, the message here, what I want to leave you with is, these challenges are actually, should be seen in terms of opportunities. Every challenge, I'll present you with 4 or 5 challenges. Each one of them can be turned into opportunities, and how can they become priorities for growth in the future. This picture, those of you who are interested in economic history, this is the famous Angus Madison graph of economic growth. I think, is one of the very few economists who had taken pains to, go back historically to the 1700s. So this is a share of Asia in global GDP. Asia used to be the most dominant region in the 1700s, and then it started declining as Western industrial power started gaining. And then now we've reached kind of in the 70s and 80s, we reached the lowest levels. Now Asia is going up again. And our prediction, we did a study called Asia 2050 at ADB. By the year 2050, our estimates show that Asian GDP will reach at least 50%. Now, if you see some more details there in terms of what we call as the Asian century scenario, this is for Asia to regain its prominence that the region had in the 1700s, it's not unrealistic to think that that scenario will be achieved. The preconditions are all there. Of course, some of the challenges that I'm going to present you with are also there. So the question is, how can we turn those challenges into opportunities, and in that context, where does an institution like ADB and other multilaterals fit? So let me, because of the audience, now here I should present some of the India opportunities with the caveat that I've been working in ADB mostly outside of India for the Southeast Asian region, China and other parts. So India, obviously, because of interest, been tracking. But these are the data that you see are based on assessments that ADB has done. So what are some of the challenges? First one is the poverty challenge. You've got significant gaps between the poorer states and the somewhat relatively better off states. And I think Tamil Nadu is here on the right hand side. Tamil Nadu has always done quite well in terms of national as well as regional rankings and global rankings in terms of inequality that we see between jurisdictions in comparable countries or countries with comparable systems. So that's good news. But then what do you do about the left-hand side, green ones? Clearly, inequality of this size that you cannot let it stay on. There, if you remember from the China picture that I showed you, China is taking vigorously and rigorously this inequality issue. Anything that we do, anything World Bank, others do, including China's own AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is looking at investments in China. Private sector investments are all going to the western parts of the country. So clearly there is a big push in terms of addressing the challenges there. Second challenge, by the way, as I said, you can replace India and you can put any country's name that you wish. In the medium term, I can bet you that these challenges are true in most of the developing countries. Growth is good. South Asia is growing very well. But are we creating quality jobs? Particularly in the context of India, informal sector is very high. Our share of the informal sector in total employment is very, very high. Now, I don't need to tell you the challenges of having this trend sustained over the medium term. By the way, there are a few countries that are kind of ticking time bombs. Indonesia is another country where I've done a lot of work. Informal sector is quite close to what we see in India, but India is quite alarming, 90%. So what is it that policymakers need to do? Looking at opportunities for creating jobs. And third one is huge infrastructure deficits. Urbanization. In fact, when we went through ADB's new corporate strategy called Strategy 2030, our president was joking for some time, maybe we should change our name to Asian City Bank. Then obviously, that wouldn't have gone very well because you need to look at rural priorities. So here, the bottom line is India needs about $115 billion per year. Now, this is after estimating that all the public and private investments will take place as planned. So that's a big assumption. If not, you have a fairly large gap. And urban development is probably among power sector, of course, given the challenges, access challenges we have across the country at large. But in terms of mobilizing funding, urban is the most difficult because of the way any country services are decentralized, devolved to local levels. Projects are risky. What kind of risk mitigation mechanisms you ought to have? Because of all those challenges, urbanization is quite difficult. And that's just quickly on inclusive urbanization. It's not just any urbanization. You need to make sure that investments are equal in terms of providing benefits to all the people, all the actors concerned. Here, if you look at the lower segment, India in terms of population living in slums is still among the largest. There are other countries also at that level, but I think certainly for large countries, India is actually quite large. Some countries have made gains. Mexico is a celebrated example. Despite its problems, they've done well to address the slum dwellers issues. And I think finally, I think this would be my last one on the medium-term challenges on actually two more. Human development outcomes closely related to what I talked about earlier. Here in terms of, in particularly in the last 3 years, the fourth industrial revolution or disruptive technologies have become the buzzword. Can all countries gain? Clearly, probably the answer is not, but all of them would like to have that aspiration. Now, their skills development is going to be very, very important. In that area, India has a lot to offer to countries in Southeast Asia. For example, we are doing a lot of networking between India, given the technology investments we made in technology related education. What is it that we can offer, India can offer to other countries, could be thought through. Now, climate change, I think this is a $1 trillion question in terms of what countries need to do at different levels. This is going to be a game changer if you make or if you don't make investments. So clearly there is recognition that we all need to invest in adaptation and mitigation. India's figures are there in terms of how much it is spending. It's about for 5% of GDP on adaptation measures. But I think investments need to be multiple folds higher. Now, not all of that will come from public sector. Private sector will need to invest also. So what can be done? Now, let me just, the last part, where does an institution like, so just to recap, short-term story, multilateralism is important. You have the macro picture, trade tensions. Medium-term story, I'd like to leave you with the thought that multilateral institutions, if they are structured well and if they provide services in improved manner, and I think here is where Mr. Krishnan will have a lot of insights, have a role to play in addressing these medium-term challenges. So we do need to continue our faith in multilateralism and multilateral institutions. Very quickly, I won't bore you with this, but you can, our website has got a lot of details. 1966, ADB was founded, 52 years. Capital, interestingly, we've gone through as any institution. We have a capital stock, we use it, we go for increase, which is a political economy issue because you do have dominant shareholders like in any institution. But we've gone through a very innovative initiative recently where Asia, unlike Africa, while poverty is still a phenomenon because of India and China, but in terms of low-income countries, by 2022, our estimates show that Nepal and Afghanistan will be the only two countries that will be eligible to receive what ADB calls as concessional assistance. All the other countries would have graduated, whereas in Africa, you still have a large number of countries that will continuously be dependent on concessional assistance from World Bank, African Development Bank, and so on. So because of that, what our shareholders agreed was to merge our concessional assistance window with what we call as normal market-based assistance, which has given us a big pool of capital that we can use quite effectively in the coming years. That's just, that's our presence, our footprint in the region. And that's just the different types of operations in terms of the market-based window, which is still quite concessional because of the operating model, AAA institution borrowing from global capital markets and lending at a very nominal rate to countries for projects. And the concessional window and technical assistance, which is quite strong. Some data there in terms of how the commitments have grown fairly consistently over the last about 10 years or so, and that's numbers. Our private sector operations, which are quite important. In fact, one of the messages that you will see later is that how can an institution like ADB, we have many private sector participants here, and many of you, maybe all of you, have the right concerns that an institution like ADB is not leveraging your resources, our resources, in the best possible manner. So how can we use our $1 of capital to leverage, say, $4 at least of private capital coming into countries? That's the aspirational goal that we are moving towards. So that's just by sectors and by country. India, in terms of annual commitment, is the largest. It's 18%, followed by some of the other countries that you see. Indonesia is quite significant. Vietnam Philippines is now growing because of a program that the President Duterte's administration has adopted, called the Build program, because he wants to push infrastructure, not just one bill, 3 bills. So a lot of efforts are going on. So these trends are changing. And then you have by sector, energy and transport have been always quite large. Now, this is quite interesting, how the poverty picture has evolved in the region. When we started or actually when we started, it was a much different picture. But you just go back to 1990s and the share of the world poor and in Asia, how the figure has changed. It's actually quite remarkable. But you still have large pockets of poverty that need to be addressed, particularly in India and China. Now, the corporate strategy that I mentioned kind of takes into account all of these issues in terms of how best ADB can address these challenges. And those are the 7 priorities. You could look up on the details. The urbanization challenge that Mr. Lakshminarayanan mentioned is at the key, is at the heart of our strategy in terms of what is it that we can do. Urban is a conglomeration of various things that are happening. What is it that we can do? Addressing all those priorities, say in the urban setting, has become a very top priority for us. And those are some of the things that we are doing. I mentioned about the resource base, and in terms of bringing in other investments, knowledge has become, particularly for large middle income countries like India and the others, knowledge sharing has become very, very important. It's not just money. We call it the finance plus. So money plus leveraging in terms of private capital that we can bring. And the last plus is the knowledge part, because globally there are lots of things that are going on. What is it that an institution like ADB can do? Now that's just a few things that is quite, these 8 principles nicely capture. Our president came up with this a few years ago. Some of it may look commonplace, but actually it's interesting. Every 10 years, by the way, a crisis keeps happening. We are lucky that after the 2008 crisis, we haven't had one. We hopefully it will stay that way. But if you look at the slowdown that is happening, continuing in some of the large economies, there may be one around the corner. So in that context, macro stability is quite important, and all the other things that are listed on the screen are quite important. Now, last part of the presentation. So here in this context, what can international institutions do to help these medium-term challenges, and why is multilateralism important? The group of 20 countries 2 years ago, they set up an eminent persons group. The web link has got the details, all the who's and who in the in global finance. Quite an impressive report. It's high level as well as it goes into some details. They came up with 3 blocks of recommendations. One is, what is it that institutions, well, by the way, this is G20, all the large countries, India is a member, as you know. Large countries can do working together, create a platform, as well as leverage the role that played by ADB, World Bank, and you have new players like the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and so on, and you've got other regional development banks. What is it that we can do to improve ourselves to have the best value for money? So achieving greater development impact. Now I won't go into all the things, but just a few points probably stand out in terms of the improving governance capacity in countries, and human capital going to be very, very important. Regional cooperation and integration. This has always been one of the key kind of the footprints or legacy type of things ADB has created. We support a large number of regional cooperation programs, including SAARC. The best well-known program is the Greater Mekong Sub-Region Program. For 25 years, thriving, it's going into the next phase. It's brought countries together to at least think regionally. National policies obviously will have to be crafted, taking into account national considerations, but that regional glue is very, very important in terms particularly of stress for countries to coordinate. Reducing systemic risks continues to be an issue, not just financial risks, but you also have health risks. Given the mobility of people, you do have a lot of surveillance things that need to be done. And then a few other things on what can be done on addressing global commons, global challenges, global public good challenges that institutions can do. Leveraging business alliances, non-governmental organizations, philanthropies, the so-called family offices of large net worth individuals. They are becoming a major source of investments for many of the base of the pyramid type investments, or particularly basic infrastructure like water supply and sanitation. What is it that institutions like ourselves can do? Second block, global financial resilience. What is it that institutions can do? And here it's a slew of things in terms of having money available, whether it is foreign exchange or liquidity, as well as how can international institutions be stronger in order to provide support. The first one is probably, I think you cannot replace that with anything. You do need very strong, deep, domestic, liquid capital markets, both equity speculative investments as well as long-term bond markets are so important. India has done very well. Corporate debt markets have grown in the last 15 years. Still a lot of room to play because if you to improve, because if you look at Thailand and Malaysia as benchmarks, those countries have done better. So what is it that a country like India can look at, and exchange views will be quite important. Safety net is, I think here I'd welcome views or institutions like the IFIs playing their role properly. What better, what improvements can be done is something that is continuously under debate. And I think the last part is, sorry, what is it that the large shareholders in the group of 20 can do to bring about better governance in these institutions? So there's a total set of 22 recommendations. All institutions are now going through right now as we speak. The G20 leaders will be meeting in Fukuoka in Japan. So that meeting is supposed to be quite, it's supposed to come up with some new initiatives as well as a stock take of what's going on these recommendations. So with that, I will leave it open, Mr. Krishnan, and then any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh Subramaniam. I think you've covered a very, very large area in a very limited amount of time. Very extensive coverage, so truly international in scope and global in scope in terms of where the various forces are pushing us. Let me sort of engage you in conversation on a couple of issues, particularly since you come from a multilateral institution and the periodic problems that we see with trade and the flows of trade, the ebbs and falls and the flows of trade. One thing that we know of is post the global financial crisis, nobody talks much more about, openness to capital flows. We are much more careful about the way capital flows are monitored and go from country to country. So open and free capital accounts for various countries is something that is not so much of a fad anymore. I mean, people are much more cautious on that front. Trade flows, you just pointed out the various risks that exist and the fact that even as an optimist, you're hoping that WTO will come back to life and the kind of risks that that poses. Services flows, I mean, we have representatives of leading IT companies, and as a software center, the kind of issues that we face with service exports, particularly in the IT sector, is fairly well known. And the last kind of international flow that we often talk about is people flows, and we know what the pressures that faces on people flows as well. And all of these are concerns that we have, and manner in which various policies are crafted at the national level and how it sort of interfaces with the global level. In that context, many people look at the the trade issues as something which we have to hark back to being, especially when you have a large domestic market like India. The temptation very often is to look at far greater import substitution, and temptation is that many people look at something like the Make in India program, which it is not intended to be that, but they look at it as an import substitution program and look at it as a mechanism by which you sort of follow a much more inward-looking strategy than an outward-looking strategy. So given the context that you've given, and I'll come to the multilateralism question shortly after this, but given the context that you have given, and given the kind of domestic policy drivers that we have in a country like India, where do we think we stand? If is it something that you pursue a much more outward-looking strategy, both in terms of investment, in terms of trade flows, in terms of human flows and everything else? Or do we look at it much more inward in terms of developing domestic markets and looking at domestic markets and making sure that we protect our domestic markets from the kind of pressures and pushes that could come from outside? Where do we think we stand today?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Krishnan. Lot of very interesting things loaded into that set of points or remarks that you made. Just a couple of points. If you look at it from a macro perspective, particularly when you are assessing policies towards managing capital flows, I think clearly in the last, you don't need to go back farther than the 1997 Asian financial crisis, or you can go back to 1990, 1991 crisis where India was affected. Clearly, I think every country will have to adopt its own measures in terms of dealing with capital flows. Now, should you be taking a risk averse position? If you're looking at it from a short-term to medium-term macro stability point of view, I would say the answer is definitely yes, because you do need to make sure that there are enough buffers in the system to deal with any untoward impacts of capital flows. If you turn the history pages, what happened in Thailand is a case in point in 1997. Indonesia is another huge case in point. It has now taken them more than 20 years to undo the negative impacts of the open capital flow regime that they had. Malaysia is a very interesting contrast, a country that took a very definitive, clear stance at that time in 1997 when Mahathir was the Prime Minister. He has now come back. Clearly strong position that, which was at that time, by the way, in the probably the international financial institutions context, was not seen as the thing to do. But I think with hindsight, the not capital controls, but certainly the more proactive measures now looking back that the Malaysian government at that time adopted have certainly helped them. So clearly, I think there it is a balancing act, particularly for a large economy like India. What position it takes, but should it turn into protectionist type of tendencies? The answer is definitely no. I think there, if we, the point that I made, we always look at it from in a regional cooperation context, that countries do need to think nationally and globally, globally and regionally. But in terms of actions, you do need to carve out actions at the national level that are appropriate for your domestic environment and context. There in that context, Make in India campaign, I think clearly, every country will have to have its own domestic industry and domestic players, not necessarily protected, but an environment in which they can thrive and they can come up. There are different ways of handling that aspiration. I think if we compare across the large Asian economies, I think what India is doing is a sensible approach. What is the pathway to reach that end goal is quite important. Are you in achieving that the Make in India aim or Make in Anywhere aim, Make in any country aim? Are you having your markets open for other players to come in? Because particularly in a large economy like India, which even if you're domestic demand dependent, you have significant opportunities for foreign players to come and invest. I used to head the procurement department in ADB, and there it was quite clear. If you look at practices across different countries, everyone will have their own national priorities. But how do you bring in foreign players to come in and work in an ecosystem where you create an overall enabling environment where you do not have protectionist tendencies, coming in? That's quite important. So it's a pathway that is important. And finally, the last point I'd like to make is the look east policy of India is particularly in the Southeast Asian context. We are looking at how to build bridges between South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. And the look east policy of the government has been immensely beneficial. The way in which we can now go and talk to the greater Mekong sub-region countries, including China, with the benefit of the look east policy is actually, the landscape is quite different from what it used to be, say, 20 years ago. So I think if we can capitalize on that, it will be quite helpful.
I mean, that since you mentioned look east, I think one of the interesting things which touches Chennai itself and Tamil Nadu in the look east context of the ADB is the Chennai Kanyakumari Industrial Corridor, which is supposed to be part of the ADB's East Coast Economic Corridor down the East Coast, Chennai Vizag, and then further Chennai Kanyakumari, and then connecting into Southeast Asia. So that's part of the overall the regional integration theme which the ADB pushes so much, and that's something that as a country India has bought into, and certainly as a state Tamil Nadu has also bought into significantly and is trying to make those investments. But I think before I throw it open to the floor, I'll have one last observation or a question, and then given the paucity of time, I'd like to throw it open to the floor so that we can get some more interaction out of the audience present here. And this is about, it's more a geopolitical issue, because you're talking about the way that multilateral institutions need to be structured and the importance of preserving multilateral institutions. One set of multilateral institutions on the trade part, which is basically the WTO system, isn't yet reviving, so there is that concern there. By your own admission, the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or any of the development banks, in terms of their total lending to the investment requirement of large countries like India, is a very small proportion of what we need. I think the World Bank and the ADB put together for India is just about $10 billion a year, which is a minuscule proportion of the total flows. So clearly, then, how do we leverage multilateral institutions? How do we use them more effectively for large economies like that? And the tendency, and if you look at the interesting thing, G20 itself is a formation of large economies and reacting against the way that the governance structures of some of the traditional multilateral institutions were structured. If you looked at the structure of the IMF or the AD or the World Bank, a country like Belgium or a country like the Netherlands had larger share structures than China or in India. And in that context, G20 itself is a reaction to that. Large economies coming together to sort of make sure that you take better control of some of the multilateral institutions. And some of the new institutions that you mentioned, the New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Bank, all outcomes post-2008, post the crisis, where in a sense, countries, the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, breaking out in a sense of the mold of the older institutions like the Bretton Woods twins, the World Bank and the IMF. But there again, for India, what is the strategy? The Western, the Western democracies, in a sense, give India a disproportionate role, possibly as a counterweight to China, possibly as a counterweight to authoritarian countries like Russia and so on. And so do you stick with them, and do you stick with the traditional institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and hope to use your influence there more effectively? Or do you go with the Chinese bandwagon and say, okay, or we shift midstream, we look to see whether the new development bank or the Asian infrastructure bank really offers an option. And again, even when you're insuring yourself against shocks, one of the lessons of the 2008 crisis was that the IMF couldn't get its act together in time, and even a country like India perhaps relied in the period after that much more on bilateral swap agreements with Japan or with a number of other countries than they did on just the IMF or any other institution. That's been our experience. So what exactly, I mean, do we ride all three horses, or do we have a foot on each one of them, or do we invest in one way? So what is it that matters for a country like India in a context like this?
Thank you. Again, fantastic insights and in the form of questions. I think my view would be that to certainly ride all horses. Now I'll tell you why. Because I think maybe I should start with from a practical point of view. Any new institution, like for example the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the New Development Bank, they're now 2-3 years old. Let us say in 20 years time they would have become more established. But all of the international institutions, because we go to the global capital markets, we have to be bound by the global regulatory environment, global regulatory requirements on how capital is treated, managed, and so on. And we will all have our exposure limits. And I think while AIIB is in terms of membership, shareholding structure is larger than that of ADB. ADB is Western and regional. All these institutions will be needing more capital as we go along, but each institution will have its own limits. Now, if you look at the infrastructure slide that I showed, the numbers that we came up in that study, $1.7 trillion of infrastructure needs every year for the next 15 years. So that's a massive figure. In fact, we thought when we came up with the numbers that it shouldn't come across like helicopter type estimates, that this sounds too large, it can't be. But we did a lot of robustness checking for those estimates, and we came to the conclusion that if you look at new investments, as well as by the time you reach say 20, 25, 30 years in term for infrastructure assets, you will talk about replacement. Operation and maintenance investments are also very, very critical. So in that scheme, 1.7 trillion may be in fact an underestimate. Now that's a massive figure. Clearly, if you look at 7% growth rate that many of the countries are having, hopefully they'll continue to have, you will have public spending will have to increase. But is it increasing at the scale that is needed? The answer is no. In the region, India, China, and Vietnam are the only 3 countries that spend about 7% of GDP on infrastructure. All the other countries are less than, they are around about 3 to 4%. That 6 to 7% figure is magical because it is needed for countries to be keeping pace with the growth in order to have infrastructure services provided to people. So in that context, I think you will have multiple institutions that will be needed in terms of leveraging resources. Now, if you take in the context of the Thurman Committee report, the G20 report, it recognizes it that there will be place for many institutions, and I think given the geopolitical issues, changes will be hopefully they'll be faster than what they have been. But still there will be inertia involved in the system in terms of how quickly, just being pragmatic here, in terms of how changes can be brought in. So I would say a country like India should certainly, India's role is immensely important. I think, as you say, from a borrowing point of view or from lending point of view, the footprint is small. But I think the influence that India can have in global institutions is significant, and it's only going to grow in the next 10, 20, 30 years or so. So clearly that role is very, very important. Now, on counterbalancing to China, I think that you will see more and more happening based on our assessments. And I think that's a good thing. Certainly countries will have to position themselves, and many will position themselves in terms of nurturing, supporting both. and in what areas can India have its influence. And if you look at, there is, I would say, I've been working on regional cooperation issues for many years. Uh, there is a lot to learn from China in terms of the way they have handled regional cooperation across at least in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Now there are also concerns being expressed in terms of how, for instance, the Belt and Road Initiative and the debt sustainability concerns that the Belt and Road Initiative has led to. Those are issues to be looked at. But those are good lessons that we can learn in terms of India having a larger footprint in the global scenario. So I would say a bit of both, but I think in India can and will, I think, punch above its weight and should, I think, yeah.
Absolutely true, and I think at least this riding multiple horses is something that we are already trying, even at the local level. For instance, phase 2 of the Chennai Metro Rail project has funding from almost all of these agencies. So, in that sense, we are looking at this multiple. And again, the real lesson is that I think one big plus for India is leveraging some of the soft power, as you point out, and the ability that you can, as a democracy, lead some of the thought on some of these crucial issues, and I think we tend to get heard much more. So on that note, I think we had planned, and we are just about a few minutes, 2 or 3 minutes behind the schedule that I had in mind. So I will throw it open for questions from the floor. So let me see, and probably what we can do is we can take about 4 or 5 questions and then answer it all together. The gentleman at the back in the green shirt, please.
Thank you, Krishnan as well as Subramaniam, for the interesting throwing of what is the structure again behind that. But my question is, you have mentioned, Subramaniam, there is a shadow banking in China, and what percentage it contributes to the development of economy? And second question is, India, you said 90% informal economy people are employed, and how do you say that? And also, what is the developed countries elsewhere, the percentage look informal sector employed, and how the transformation will take place and how it will contribute to the bottom line? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is, actually, I want to lift from the theme for the talk, the role of ADB, the knowledge sharing, autogenous growth, and link it to the water crisis that we are facing here in Chennai today. Now, you presented 2 interesting data points. The share of ODA being very insignificant, and the second, finance plus plus. So the second plus is about knowledge sharing, and we need a war footing basis effort to solve the crisis. And I just recall a tweet this morning which said war means wisdom after retirement. So we need that effect. Do you have an institutional mechanism? Because I know that there are a lot of people who are water experts who work for ADB in India. Do you have an institutional mechanism that you can use those resources, the war resources, in terms of knowledge sharing, leave the ODA part, just knowledge sharing to solve some of these infrastructure problems, and more specifically the water problem in Chennai?
Mr. Subramaniam, my question to you is not addressed to you in your capacity from ADB, but more as an international economist. And my questions are 2 questions, and they are geopolitical. Given the condition of the sad condition of multilateralism in the world today, in a Trumpian world, 5 years ago, there was a lot of hope and talk about a BRICS bank, a transnational bank which would address the issues of developing economies like large economies like India, China. Why has the whole idea failed? Is it still? Do you think it still has a chance of success? And if not, why not? My second question is that once again, in an international world where trade conflicts are everywhere. Do you think that before these trade conflicts are resolved, do you think trade, dollar denominated trade will still survive? Or do you think the currency war, the currency conflicts have to be first resolved as the means to resolve trade conflicts? Thank you.
Yes, I would like to ask on the issue of inequality, particularly the economic one which we are facing in India as well as in China. And the second one is about the Belt and Road Initiative. I recently read a media newspaper report that it is actually a military initiative disguised as an economic one. So your comments on this and your solutions. Thank you.
Mr. Krishnan, the question is addressed to you. From what I've understood, I'm not an economist, but from what I've understood, that the amount of funding from ADB to India seems to be much less than Netherlands or Belgium. I don't know whether that premise is right. And if so, what are the steps that the government, both at the state level, at the central level, are seeking from ADB or other institutions which fund us as to what is wrong with us? Why is it you are not giving us the money which we want, while you have studied all over the place and found out this is where the money should be spent? That's it.
Very interesting questions. Thank you very much. On the first question on the shadow banking in China, data are kind of patchy, but China has certainly put in a lot of efforts. Shadow banking, it happens at the, largely at the municipal level, at the local government level, small institutions. And now, interestingly, those of you who are in the finance space, there is concern on what is known as peer-to-peer lending that needs to be monitored as well. In India, peer-to-peer lending is actually growing. In many other countries, it's growing, but that's not shadow banking. Different kind of concern that's emerging. The estimate in terms of share, based on what I have seen, what we've seen, it ranged kind of anywhere between 20 to 30%. Which is quite high, and that is why the policy measures that the country has put in have been quite stringent, and they've been I won't say they are bringing it down, but certainly there is a lot more regulatory control, or at least in terms of grasp of understanding what is going on. So situation now is much better than what it used to be, say 3-4 years or so ago, but it is quite significant. In a way, there are, different countries have their own mechanisms that private sector comes up with, and shadow banking is basically a reaction in terms of how, like a small businessman's needs can be met. Some of you may know in the Philippines there is actually a famous system called 5-6. You basically take 5 pesos in the morning and you have to give 6 pesos in the evening. 20% rate every day. May be seen as usurious, but it has a place to play. Indians are involved, but the views are mixed. There is a proper technical assessment that has been done, that it has served a useful purpose in terms of particularly micro, very small scale type of businesses to be sustained. On the informal sector, in the slide that I showed, you've got some data on other countries. In the region, Indonesia and Philippines are very similar, large. Now, it also depends on definitions that different countries have on how a small enterprise is defined. If it is less than 10 employees, they may not come under the regulatory purview in terms of getting a license, getting approvals for setting up businesses and so on. So that also has a big impact on the number being quite large. And also for tax and other reasons, inspections and so on, many may not report, many may not want to report. You may want to stay informal. Indonesia is a case in point for that phenomenon. Now, what is bad about it? I think the issues in terms of if you start from the base of the pyramid, labor rights, worker rights, they won't get any benefits. Particularly if you're looking at well, minimum wage compliance, that is a major issue in many countries. But if you're looking at, say, after 25, 30 years of employment, they may not have anything. Old age income security is a major problem. So US AID did a study called the Oasis project in India, Indonesia, Philippines, and a few other countries about 5 years back. And the numbers are quite huge, quite alarming, and clear policy implications in terms of why we need to address. On Vaidi's question on knowledge sharing, what can we do? There is definitely an institutional mechanism. If we, well, there are many aspects of the problem, as you all would know very well. And many cities have been going through a lot of water stress. In some cases was known, steps were taken. In some cases not known, steps have been taken in a patchy way. I'll cite a couple of examples of where cities have been successful. Dhaka, about 10 years back, they had a non-revenue water share or ratio of 40%. 40% of water that was treated and supplied to people, it was leaking away in terms of no revenue coming in. And that through an ADB engagement, we've helped the country bring it down to single digits. It's still high, but it's now in the range of about 7-8% or so. Philippines, Metro Manila, an interesting case, completely went private sector way. There are 2 water concessions that were that were signed about 25-30 years ago. Quite vibrant, both doing quite well. But now, in the last 6 months, we've been facing a huge water crisis. Now there it is a bulk water or raw water crisis. With somehow the demand projections were not really in sync with how the one part of Metro Manila has grown. So as a result, everyone kind of caught off guard. There is now a water rationing that has been going on. So we are now putting together a bulk water improvement, water security project, as well as in terms of what can be done to improve the conditions of the concession agreement between the regulatory authority of the contracting agency and the service provider. So I think in terms of knowledge sharing, in fact, we are going to have a forum in a month or 2 months time on water crisis, water stress that we are facing in the region. Few countries, including India, will be invited. So there are certainly models to look at. Malaysia, we are working with. Indonesia is another. I had an interesting chat with Mr. Krishnan earlier on in terms of particularly those who do not have access, at least those who have some means of accessing water, such as paying for water, at least they have a recourse, but there are lots of people, millions of people without such access. What can we do to them through slum upgrading type of projects? There are interesting models that have emerged in Indonesia and Philippines. So clearly there are solutions. It's not a one solution fit all type of thing. It needs to be tailored for each city, each country, but that knowledge sharing we are doing, we can certainly do more. On the, sir, your 2 questions on the geopolitical question. BRICS Bank is basically, well, I mean, the idea is now transformed into the New Development Bank. So it is there. It is now 2 years functioning quite successfully. They have, I forget the exact number, but last year, for example, they lent about $700-800 million or so. If I remember the figure. So it is there and it will grow. It will be an important institution. As it happens in India, Mr. Kamath is the first CEO, the president CEO of the bank. I think on the second question is very, very interesting. Up until the recent the China-US trade conflict, renminbi transactions that are denominated in renminbi, they've been growing gradually, but in pretty significant terms. In 2016, if I remember the figures, about about anywhere between 48 to 50% of trade transactions were denominated in renminbi. Before the Asian financial crisis, there was a very strong possibility that yen may become the alternate currency, but then because of the trade pattern shifting, then renminbi could have been that alternative currency for settlements. But now, by the way, still about 40% of the trade transactions globally are in renminbi. So it is still a force to reckon with. I think US dollar has got still significant share of it. Now, will the trade conflict have an impact on it? What way it is going to turn, that I think certainly will have will need to be watched. We don't have any recent estimates on that, but it is certainly, it's put a dampener on renminbi becoming the second dominant currency for settlements. Euro has actually, it was dollars, euro, renminbi, and then there was a period when renminbi took the second place. Now it may have slipped back to the third tier of importance. On the inequality questions, I think as I mentioned, as you saw in the figures, clearly both countries, India, China, are adopting their own measures. You do have, many other countries have peripheral area programs or backward regions programs. There are dedicated ministries, and I believe India has got a dedicated ministry as well to deal with backward regions or regions that need more support. So I guess here, in terms of, could there be targeted infrastructure development programs or other livelihood type of programs that can be tailored, that definitely needs to be looked at. In China and Indonesia, Philippines, for example, is a fascinating, well, actually it's a depressing story, but fascinating from a data point of view. Southern part of the Philippines, poverty is very, very high. Upwards of 60% of people are below the poverty line. So there are conditional cash transfer programs that have been rolled out for the past 10 years or so that are beginning to have a huge impact in terms of lifting people out of poverty and reducing at least inequality between regions. So there are different initiatives that can be looked at. On BRI being, well, I mean, there are multiple views. I have, on my iPad, as when you raised the question, I was just thinking, I have about 300 articles, and then you have clearly military, perspectives that China gaining influence has been there. But I think, if you look at the way China has been steadily investing in promoting regional cooperation, in Africa, Latin America, or in closer to home in the Greater Mekong sub-region, it's been a kind of a deliberate process of identifying investment opportunities. For instance, there is a large railway project between Kunming in China and Vientiane in Laos, People's Democratic Republic. This project has been talked about for a long time, but it's now been kind of brought under the BRI radar. But it has been always, there have been discussions going on between China and Lao PDR. So I think, there is certainly probably stronger economic factors behind, and I think some of the geopolitical kind of shifts that are taking place, a country like China trying to position itself, there are lots and lots of factors here at work that need to be seen.
Your question, sir. First, let me clarify. I didn't say that Belgium and Netherlands give us more money. What I said is that the shareholding of countries like Belgium and Netherlands at some point in the IMF and the World Bank was higher than India or China. That is a different point altogether. That has changed and needs to change further. So that was a limited point. On the issue of why can't we get more money? See, the fundamental problem, which I think Dr. Ramesh Subramaniam alluded to during his talk, was about the capital requirement of the World Bank or the ADB, because they have an overall limit of how much they can lend, and they also have single borrower limits like any prudential institution would have. And I think India, given its overall requirements, hits the single borrower limit quite consistently. We are very confident in our negotiations with the ADB and the World Bank simply because they love us and we love them. I mean, as customers, India is one of the strong customers for both of these institutions. Implements projects well, repays, and there is a mechanism. And in particular, Tamil Nadu stands out, and so they're quite happy lending to states like that. But the real difficulty is that they have a limit of how much they can actually lend, and we are hitting those ceilings. So, which means that those funds need to be used very prudently and strategically, and which is where the point that you made about Finance Plus Plus becomes important, that you leverage this to achieve certain other objectives in terms of system change, in terms of reform, and in terms of improvement that needs to be done. So you build an agenda of what you think needs to change and try to use this kind of funding to sell some of that reform to a number of constituencies within the state, within the country, within the government. So it's a way in which it needs to be used strategically so that we achieve the optimum objectives. If their capital goes up, they will be able to lend significantly more, and then I presume, at least as of now, we can borrow. The real issue is that our needs are so much more. So you need this, and you need a variety of other kinds of financing to take care of what our projects are.
It's like the ancient mariner's story, the poem, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. Chennai has got a huge coastline, and the number of desalination plants over the last 20 years, the team, I think, put up the first one on the Marina Beach. But I think there's a lot of pressure not to continue that at that time, and now only a couple of them have come. Why can't we actually use that strategy? We got 2 rivers, they're polluted, and we are not making enough efforts. Can the citizens not play a role in a much larger way to change the demography? It could be an Amsterdam or one of these things. That's what Chennai is, but we are ruining it.
I don't know to whom that question was addressed to. Quite frankly, I think it's to all of us in this auditorium in terms of the sets of issues that we need to do. But I don't deal with this issue right now. But in terms of desalination plants, I think amongst large states, we probably are the only state which actually has desalination capacity. We have a working capacity of 200 MLD, one at Minjur and one at Nemeli, with more to be added. There's a 150 MLD plus another 400 MLD, so about 550 MLD to be added here in Chennai, and more capacity to be added further south in Thoothukudi and in Ramanathapuram and so on. But we have to be careful because desalination is one high cost, because there's a high energy cost, and the cost of actually delivering 1 kiloliter of water is 45 rupees, 50 rupees, and we have to be prepared to pay for it, and somebody has to pay for it, and those costs have to be met. So there is also a question of pricing of water. I think all of us are highly subsidized in terms of the water we use. Those of us who live in the largest of bungalows are probably the most subsidized. We pay 50 rupees a month as the standard fee, regardless of how much we consume, and that's, I think, something all of us need to realize. So this hall probably has some people who get the highest water subsidy in the country. So this is again something we need to realize. The other part of it is that, let's not forget, I mean, sometimes it's easy to get carried away and say that, oh, we don't do anything right, but there are a number of things we do right too. I think our rainwater harvesting is truly a big success story. So when we set our mind to things, we do a fairly decent job. The cleanup of the water bodies and the cleanup of how these can become collection systems, I think that is becoming a people's movement across the surrounding neighborhoods of Chennai. That is happening much more, and I do remember an event here in CIC and in this very auditorium of a couple of examples which have been taken up and which have been successful, and I'm sure that will also take up much more. But I think we also need to realize challenges like climate change. I mean, I think there is clear evidence to show that we get far more intensive rainfall on far fewer days in the year. I think that is showing up as evidence. So there are things which we have to contend with, and we have to mitigate and try and figure out. So yes, it's a crisis. We have not had any rain at all in 180 days. So that in itself is a indicator of what needs to happen. But also, I think it teaches us how to use water much more effectively. And preventing NRW, there are projects within the state of Tamil Nadu which have actually been very successful at preventing non-revenue water, but there are distribution systems and maintenance systems which need to improve. We have a very interesting project happening right now in Coimbatore in association with a private company which sort of will substantially enhance the utilization of water. So I think there are a number of good initiatives, and we also need nature to play its role, and together probably we'll be able to solve that particular crisis. Any last words on that?
No, I think you covered all the issues. Based on projects that ADB has supported in a few countries, recent ones are in Fiji and in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka and Jaffna, we have a desalination project. The technology has been there, but still in terms of keeping the maintenance costs low, still a lot of technology improvements are needed because otherwise the O&M costs can be prohibitively high, and that's a lesson that we've learned in both projects. Certainly can be looked at. Singapore is another country that has invested quite heavily, but it's also a scale issue. What are you looking at in terms of your the population base that you'll be serving, what purpose you'll be using. But I think in addition to that, if it can be tested on a small scale basis to see if it works for limited needs, but then again that O&M sustainability is very, very critical. But I would instead focus on the overall enabling environment that that is where I think partly what Vaiti raised in terms of, in addition to on the technical side solutions that you can bring about, what kind of enabling environment changes that you can make. Heavily subsidized tariff structure, that certainly needs to be looked at. And the Manila case that I mentioned clearly has thrown open basic awareness on water conservation is not there. In fact, Manila looked at the rainwater harvesting system of Chennai as a case, as an example and point. So I think those measures in the background are very, very critical. So water is going to be, in terms of infrastructure, the thing is, large scale energy transport projects gobble up a lot of money, so there is a lot of attention on it. But basic water provision, sanitation, access are going to be humongously important issues in the next 10 years. Now, water is obviously immediate crisis that we need to deal with. Yeah.
So you quoted that because of the US-China trade tensions and all that, the other economies might benefit in the short run, but long run it's not going to. Can you highlight some more on that? You quoted some soya bean case. And one more thing, you quoted one economy might shake. Can you highlight on which economy is going to shake? Like in future, you quoted a line like that. And
oh, is it okay? No, I need to think back on that. But on in terms of more details, the data that I shared, they cover about 12 countries where you'll have statistically significant negative or positive impacts. And many of them are the newly industrialized economies, still that term is persisting. And some of the Southeast Asian economies. South Asia is not likely to lose or gain in the short term, but in the medium term, that is 5 years and beyond, we do see negative impact. That's more because of the knock-on effects. And if the trade diversion effects that I showed persist, that enable countries, take for example Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia and Philippines, to put in place measures to capitalize on those trade diversion effects, then even larger economies like India may be feeling the pinch in terms of seeing more negative effects. Bangladesh is a very interesting case in point. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, within the garment manufacturing industry, the change that they have gone through over the last 5 years, phenomenal in terms of the shifts that they have put in place. For example, undergarments, they've gone really high value undergarments manufacturing. The market share in terms of the value add, it's over 20, close to 15 to $20 billion in both countries. Vietnam, right now, capitalizing on the textiles industry gains that they're making. In fact, I was there last week talking to an EU Vietnam forum. There they're looking at how can they move into more high value products like technical textiles. So continuous improvements are needed. So that's why the trade diversion thing, which is trade diversion effect, which is where you're seeing the immediate positive impact. What measures countries can put in place is also going to be determining in terms of the impact. Now I can't recall which country I mentioned, but I would certainly, I don't think it's in the trade conflict context, it's not easy to point to one country that can have a dominant gain or loss. Between the two countries, China is certainly likely to lose more based on the assumptions that we made. But clearly, I think our analysis is that in the 5 to 10 year space, all will be losers.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, on behalf of the Chennai International Center trustees, wish to thank you, Dr. Ramesh Subramaniam, sorry about the end, for being here with us today and for a very insightful evening. Mr. Krishnan, we are ever thankful to you. Thank you for being with us here today and also, engaging with us periodically and opening us up to new ideas and speakers. And Shri Vishwanathan sir, thank you very much for facilitating this program this evening. And we're very happy to have you all here, and we hope you can attend more programs and benefit from it. We would love to hear from you. So if you have, thoughts to share, feedback, suggestions, whatever, please feel free to write to us. And we'll keep you posted on the upcoming programs as well. Thank you so much.